Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. India's economy has been the subject of great debate and concern. What looked like a slippery slope over the last few quarters got accentuated and exaggerated because of COVID. The COVID months themselves saw an extreme collapse in the growth levels that we had been seeing recently. And post that, the reconstruction of the economy seems quite frankly lopsided. While some parts are recovering, for example, the formal economy, other parts, especially the MSMEs and the informal economy, seem to be struggling and hemorrhaging. What's even worse is that many key verticals, whether it's education, healthcare, the banking space, have more question marks than answers at this point. In their book Unshackling India, authors and economists Salman and Ajay Chibber explore those facets exactly. They look at what the problems are, they look at where the solutions might lie, and they look at why it's important for the state to start stepping away from the business of running business, but this time doing it with intent rather than speech. They join me now to talk about their book. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining in. Congratulations on your book, Unshackling India. There is much to unshackle, I will admit. Salman, let me start with you and where we're at right now, where we seem to have finally arrived on an alphabet which looks like a K, but we seem not to have enough experience on what that kind of economy is for any nation. How would you say we're plotted, given what ground we've covered through COVID and where we're at right now?
Well, this whole idea of recovery, whether it's V-shaped or K-shaped or what have you, I don't, the way we approach this book is not really to think of just this moment, but in some ways we're thinking about the future and saying this moment is an opportunity. The way the recovery's happened, of course, I mean, as anyone can tell, and it's not just in India. I think you have this unbalanced recovery in many places, but for India is particularly worrisome because for many years now, inequality has been rising, and the pandemic, the way it's kind of ravaged India, I think it only exacerbates those challenges. We had hoped that the way we would deal with this crisis, we may be able to mitigate some of the trajectory of this inequality. But of course, that has not proven to be correct. Part of the problem may be that India was already in a pretty difficult situation coming into the crisis. And everything that's happened subsequently seems to suggest things have actually gotten worse. But again, like I said, this book is truly saying, yes, we know there are problems. There are plenty of problems, and they've come up over time. But what can we do now? What do we need to do now to really create a level of prosperity that India deserves, Indians deserve, and possibly we can even actually achieve. So what is achievable? So I leave it at that, and maybe Ajay has something to add on this.
Ajay, let me actually take that point forward with you on this concept of unshackling India, because there is a sense or a feeling at this point, looking at the economic condition of India, that this is beyond crucial. This is sort of a make or break that we're at right now. Whatever work got done in the last 75 years could either take a very, very bad turn for itself, or, as Salman pointed out, solutions could be put on the table and addressed, and things could be fixed. Which way are you veering?
So I think, as Salman said, and we quote the Mahatma Gandhi in the book saying the future is what we do now. And I think what a crisis does, like the 91 crisis did, was, focus the mind. And what a crisis should do is focus our mind. And that's what we try to do in this book, is to say, okay, we knew we had made progress. There's no doubt about that. But that we were seeing huge problems emerging: inequality, very vulnerable employment, a farm crisis, the things we lay out in the book.
Mhm.
And what a shock should do is to shake us up. And what this shock did is, of course, expose some of these weaknesses to a much greater extent. The fact that we have a very weak health system,
Yes.
that we have a state which is intervening in everything, but actually doing most of the things quite badly. We are even reversing the liberalization that was started in the 91 reforms with rising protectionism. We are seeing that our banking system is in a huge, huge mess. So all these things we bring together in this book. And I think what the book also does is sort of say, okay, these are provides not just the diagnosis of the problem, but also say, okay, we need some pretty bold solutions to address these. And I think the book tries to lay that out. One thing that I may add, Mitali, that Salman and I bring is, while we have knowledge of India, what we bring to this perspective on India is also the fact that we have worked all over the world, and not just in developed countries, but also in many other middle-income developing countries, which are struggling with these sorts of issues like India is. So we bring that international perspective in every chapter. We try to do that, which is because, when I first came back to India after a long time and started talking about various problems and solutions, the response I would always get is, well, that may have worked in such and such place, but India is different. It's not going to work here. And as we discover, sort of struggling on with these problems, the responses of Indians to many problems is no different from the responses of Brazilians or Chinese or anybody else. I mean, people behave quite differently. Of course, the context is different. The institutional structure is different. The cultural heritage is different. But taking all that into account, what we try and show is also that while India may have done well compared to, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or even 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, the world hasn't stood still. The world has moved on. And look where the rest of it is, right? Look where China is. Look where Korea is. Look where much of East Asia is. And so we don't sit in a motionless world, and therefore we have to benchmark ourselves with that world.
Mm. That's actually a perfect segue into my next question, because that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Salman, the last time we talked about your book, it was about a lost decade. And I was reading how you talked about, and you have actually put everything against the global context. But here's my concern, which is that even by its own standards, I mean, forget about global comparisons, India has lost more than a decade's worth of good work, has it not?
Well, anytime you have this kind of a crisis, of course, there is going to be a loss of, past development gains. And this is not unique to India. It happens across the globe. It's just a matter of who's able to better manage a particular crisis. Like I said, India was already in a very difficult situation before the pandemic hit. And of course, with the pandemic and then this whole decision to go for a lockdown, which was, to my mind, not fully thought through. I think those are things that actually sowed the seeds of great trouble, I think, for the foreseeable future. Now, I think in the book we talk about an NCER study which says that, look, it'll take up to 2028 to 2029 when we get back to the pre-pandemic trajectory. Now that seems like a lot of years, but this has happened before. When the global financial crisis hit, the U.S. did not get back to its pre-crisis trajectory until 2018. In fact, not even in 2018, which was more than 10 years after the crisis had hit. But again, then the question is, then what should the focus be? The focus should be on, okay, we have a crisis. We know it is, India's situation is not very good. But can we use this as an inflection point and say, let us shift gears and let us do the kinds of things that are needed so that this recovery period is shorter. But more importantly, we instead of focusing on the recovery, we focus on where do we want to take India?
Yeah.
Where should it be in 25 years? That's the focus. And I think in this book, in these different parts of this book, that is what we try to get at. And of course, we talk about, of course, there's a lot of there's a diagnostic element to this. There's this element of look at these other countries and look what they've done. I was just reading parts of the book today, and I said, while during when the pandemic hit, Korea was rolling out a national testing plan, and India did not have state-level epidemiologists in 11 states. We were looking for epidemiologists while other countries were doing different things. Be that as it may, it doesn't mean that we now just keep kind of saying, okay, yeah, it's bad, it's terrible, and all that. We know that. Our goal was to simply say, okay, fine, we have this, but this is the crisis. Now maybe people will be more amenable to bolder ideas. Maybe some things will be painful, some things will be not that painful, but let's try and document that. And that's what we are trying to do.
Ajay, an underlying thread through the book is the fact that you point to the need to be a less interventionist state while looking at the economy. One point of criticism, though, that came through during COVID was not about intervention necessarily, but about being more supportive as a government. And it was pointed out that the government did not do enough in terms of bringing the economy back, in terms of building enough of a monetary support net that was required at that point. Now, some believe that perhaps India was wise in its decision and did not spread itself too thin. Where do you stand on that one?
So I think that's a good point, Mitali. But as we say in the book, the government in India needs to do a lot more in certain areas. It's so like in health, particularly education, national defense, and now increasingly we will need in the state to do a lot more on climate change because it's a collective action problem, climate change. Air pollution is not going to get solved by the state not intervening, right? So, but then what we diagnose is that because the Indian state is involved in so many other things it need not be involved in. Until recently, with the example of trying to run an airline, at least now they've managed to sell that off. But like that, I did a very detailed study of India's PSUs when I was at NIPFB. So there are about 250 of them still. And then at the state level, you have about 1,200 state-level public enterprises and undertakings. So it's just that the government in India is not doing those things it needs to do, like health, basics like health, education, even defense. Our defense spending until recently, if you take out the OROP part of it, the pension part of it, was the lowest as a share of GDP in the last 50 years. And only recently, because of Galwan, now they have ramped up a little bit. So I think what we are saying is the state should do the things that the state is required to do and do them well. And what the crisis has exposed is how underspent we are on health and how badly it is structured as well. The other point we make is that so much of India is so centralized, the government is so centralized. Just to give you a comparison, we think of China as a very totalitarian, authoritarian state, right? More than 50% of spending in China, of government spending, is done not even at the provincial level or the state level. It is done at the local level. In India, that number is less than 5% of GDP. The mayors and the panchayats are completely starved of resources. So when you have to respond to a pandemic, you can have the central government making all kinds of plans, but then the actual implementation of those will have to be done at a level And as Salman points out, if 11 states don't even have an epidemiologist because they just don't have the resources for it, perhaps, or nobody even thought about it, or nobody focused on it while they were spending money on all kinds of other, grandiose things that governments tend to do and cut ribbons. So this is the diagnosis we have come to in this, that it's the state is into so many things and does most of them very badly, whereas it should concentrate itself on a fewer things, the basic things that the state needs to do, and do them much, much better.
And if I may, Mitali, at this point of decentralization is also, I think that's a running, in some ways, a running theme of the book. And I think we don't talk about it enough. We talk about, for example, China and, the industrialization model followed by China, and we say, oh, this is a labor-intensive model, and everything. Look at where China is today. But what we do not actually focus on is how decentralization actually helped China in all sorts of things and get to where it is now. People don't talk about it. If you talk about China and China's growth, everyone will talk about how much labor was absorbed because of industrialization. People do not talk about the bottom-up approaches that China used to get to where it is today. And I think if we do not decentralize more, if we do not decentralize authority and finances and things, no matter what we say in this book, I think it's not going to happen, because ultimately we have to really empower the communities and local governments. I think otherwise none of this is going to happen.
Salman, you write in your book about the privatization process, and I quote from what you all have written: in order to avoid the charge that the government is selling the family's silver, the proceeds from the privatization and sales of assets of closed firms should not go back into the budget, but should be put into the National Infrastructure Investment Fund. In light of your suggestion, let me ask you about the NMP, which has been accused of doing exactly that, selling the family silver with not enough thought about the process, about the repercussions. Is the government being advised badly, or is the government just looking at bad solutions?
This is a tricky question for me, because I'm also, in some ways political. But what we said in the book, and I think what is generally accepted as a good way to go, is let's be transparent about a process. Let's establish a framework. And if we have to privatize certain entities, well, let's do it in a way that people understand. Let us see what those resources are going to be used for, and let that all be in the public domain, and let it be, I think that's a good practice. We don't want a Russian style oligarchy coming up in India, although I think we may be a little late for that. But my sense is there is this search for a headline. I think that, to my mind, is reckless. Air India being sold off the way it has, I'm not so sure, even I understand fully how they did it, because it's not clear to me. I don't know if it was valued properly. I don't know how the bidder, I think one of the bidders said, we just put in a bid because we thought 2 would be necessary, and that's why we came in. But ultimately, if you're going to use this money for budgetary purposes, then I think that also defeats the purpose, right? You cannot use sales of such entities, to my mind, for basic public financial management. I think we should have some sort of a fund. We should have the objectives of that fund should be clear.
Yeah.
I think those should be for longer term purposes instead of solving the finance minister's current budgetary problems. Yeah. But I don't know. Maybe Ajay has a different view on this, but this is what I really think.
Yeah. No, this is very correct. So just to give you a little perspective on this, Mitali, because I did this very detailed study on which that chapter is based.
Yeah.
The total, if you think of a balance sheet of the government, right? And you think of running expenditure like you have for any household, you have running expenditure of the government. But then you have assets. You have a house, or you have a car, or you have certain things, right? So you think of it in the same way that there is a capital balance sheet of the government, which is made up of all the land and equipment and assets that these public sector companies own. And that total roughly is about $500 billion, that total asset. Now, 1/3 of that is in 7 companies, the 7 big Maharatnas that, there are about, or 10 Maharatnas now. Earlier it was 7, now I think there's 3 more added. More than 1/3 of those assets are actually just in those 7, 8 companies, right? And those obviously are very strategic companies: oil, gas, steel, coal, and privatizing them at this point would not be such a wise idea. But their performance, as we point out, can be improved quite considerably by subjecting them to much greater sort of commercial standard pressure. And I don't want to go into more detail, but if you like, we can. But then there's a whole slew of these other companies, right? Like you have Air India, but you also have MMTC, MMTL. I mean, you can think of so many. There, another 230 of these. And there's no particular great crying reason why those should be. But when you sell them, you don't want to be. Some of them, of course, are loss makers. I don't know whether you'll get anything from them. You probably have to just close them down and monetize the assets, the land, etc. But for the rest of it, if you think that you've sold a car or a house or a certain capital item, then you start spending that money on buying dal and atta and chawal. Well, that's like selling the family silver to pay the grocery bill.
Yeah.
So what we suggest is that you already have the NIF, the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, whose purpose is to use government capital and then draw in other capital from the private sector and even from abroad, because India has a huge infrastructure deficit that it has to catch up with, right? And we also have a deficit not just in physical infrastructure, but also in social infrastructure, schools, health centers, etc. So that's the idea. And the oligarch thing is very simple, that, if you have process by which you will sell it off, like was done in large parts of Latin America and Russia, all you will do is have a hand. You will be basically taking government monopolies and making them into private monopolies. And that's not going to be helpful to the economy or increasing competitiveness, or for the consumer for that matter. So that's the logic of what we are trying to say there in that particular chapter, that the process does matter. And then, if you give people more shares in the sold companies, you end up then with a greater feeling of ownership and acceptability of that privatization process.
Salman, let me pivot to what's happening in the financial industry, where it almost seems an eerie silence about how bad the situation could be having come out of COVID. I mean, some chinks did show up in some of the listed banks and the NPAs that they reported in the last few quarters. Are we not talking about the problem, or is it your sense that we seem to have tided this over without too much damage? Because this is the big one, this is the spinal cord of the economy.
Well, yes. I mean, I think the financial sector is at the heart of many of India's problems today, and it has been like this for a long time. In fact, this whole crisis, in some ways, started towards the end of the UPA. Yeah. Lots of organizations were kind of screaming and saying that, look, this could be a problem in the future, and now 7-8 years into this current government, I still don't get the sense that we have really done enough to grapple with this problem. And I think the biggest problem here is lack of transparency again. Your question is, are we not talking about it, or have we really kind of maybe it's not such a big problem? My response would be that we don't know. But my sense is that things could have just improved because of COVID. Things have gotten worse, much, much worse. It's just that we don't know the extent of the problem. And till somebody comes up and says, okay, look, I mean, I'm sure that once we go back to normal, and I don't know when we're going to go back to normal, but I don't see how you're able to imagine you have all these loans outstanding. Your business is down. In many sectors, business is way down. How do you repay those loans? And if you have not repaid those loans, have you been declared an NPA? Or have you not been declared an NPA? What kind of moratorium are we seeing? So I don't know. I think that I worry that the problem is much worse than it was before the pandemic started. And no amount of corporate profits is going to lead me to believe otherwise. I think there is a problem, and it's a widespread problem. It's not just at the corporate level. I think, I'm pretty sure even mudra level loans are in trouble. So I think this is going to lead to, if we don't deal with this properly, I think this can lead to further heart attacks to the economy in the coming years. And I really think that this is one area, the financial sector, that we really must address as quickly and as carefully as possible, and with transparency. If you don't have transparency, I mean, you don't trust the financial sector, then all hell is going to break loose.
Ajay, in fact, I want to, go back into your book where you're talking about this, and you'll say, if you look deeper, India has been undeserved by its financial system more fundamentally than just the issue of bad loans. India has the least efficient and the least inclusive financial system in the world as well. Is there a lot more, deep digging that's required over here, aside from dealing with what could be a growing NPA problem?
So I think, there's a lot that's been written on the financial system, and, there are tomes and tomes of reports. So what we try to do here, Mitali, is to say, okay, let us pick 2 or 3 very obvious indicators that any common person would be able to understand to show what the extent of that problem is. Now, so one indicator we picked was what we call the intermediation ratio, which is you have a financial system that takes deposits and is supposed to create credit and lend out money. Okay, how much does that system cost? And as we show with international comparison, we have one of the least efficient financial systems in the world, right? Because the difference between the saving, what the saver gets and what the lender pays is close to 500 to 600 basis points, 5 or 6%. You look at China, it's 300 basis points. You look even at Bangladesh and Pakistan, it's 300 to 400 basis points. And of course, I don't even mention places like Malaysia, etc., where it's probably 100, 150 basis points, or Japan for that. So we say, look, we are running one of the most inefficient financial systems. It's closer to what a Russian or a Venezuelan or a Brazilian financial system. So that's one indicator we give. The other indicator we say is, okay, we did all this nationalization. And by the way, 300 basis points out of that comes from general inefficiencies. But about 200 basis points comes because the banks have to now provision for NPAs. So, that 500-600 basis points that I talk about is that high because of all the NPAs in the system also, besides all the other things we mentioned.
Yeah.
Then we look at is this system, we nationalize the banks, we have directed lending, all this was meant to kind of make the system more inclusive. Now we have these mudra banks, etc. Then when we look at comparisons across the world, we find we have the least inclusive financial system in the world. If you look at the percentage of people who actually use the banking system, those who access their accounts, those who take loans, we're way below even Bangladesh next door, right?
Yeah.
So you say you have the most inefficient and the least inclusive financial system. Then the whole purpose of the financial system is to dish out credit, right? So the third indicator we give is how much credit is it giving? And we find we are at 50% of GDP. That's another international comparison. Most of our East Asian neighbors are well over 100% of GDP. So the system isn't even performing what it's supposed to perform, which is provide credit to people.
Yeah.
And then we go into the whole issue of the NBFCs also, and I can talk more on that. But let me just stop here and say, so what we are saying is, look, forget all the stuff, jargon you read about the financial system. Let us take 3 simple indicators and point out where the nature of the problem is. And just to add on the point that Salman was making earlier, the 2020 financial stability report of the RBI said because of COVID, the NPAs, which were already very high and should have been resolved much faster before, and we can go into IBC and all that, it was going to go up to close to 14.5%. Suddenly in the 2021 report, they've dropped that down to I think 12% now. So either, as he says, either the forbearance that they are providing is taking things, and that the problem may actually be much worse, or we may be going back to the old ways of doing business before, when the problem was hidden for a long time and then got revealed once Raghuram Rajan started to get strict with it.
Yeah.
In 2015. So, we don't want to go back to those old ways that we just hide the problem, because that's like just cancer spreading through the whole system, right? So let me stop here and we can talk more on it if you like, on IBC, on bad bank and all those solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a whole show in itself, and I'm running a bit short on time. But Salman, cannot not ask you about the twin devils of education and unemployment. Ajay, we're just talking about how we're second to a couple of South Asian nations, but World Bank data on employment rates for India are now at 42.4%. So we're below Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, just above Somalia. Where are we?
Yeah.
And how bad
Somalia is at
unemployment?
41%. Look, yeah, I mean, the problems are so enormous. Sometimes you wonder what can be done. But just speaking on education first. I think it's not just a financing problem. Education has a governance problem. Education has many layers of problems. And people have, you can write books and books about India's education system and how it doesn't serve the children well, it doesn't serve parents well, it doesn't serve teachers well, it doesn't serve anybody well. But we have to, we keep talking about aspirational India. We make big statements about how India is going to be a $5 trillion economy or a $10 trillion economy, global superpower, global economic power. But here's the reality. The reality is that 80% of second graders cannot read basic text in India, which places India in the category of maybe a country like Malawi. That's what it is. And no amount of chest thumping is going to take us anywhere unless we actually recognize that there's a serious problem and it needs solutions that are not necessarily in some sort of a national education policy that we can come up with, because India is a very diverse country. India is a huge country. It requires decentralized governance, especially in things like education. And we need to really focus. There's so the mind boggle. There's so much to be done here. I mean, if you have 35% stunting in India, please don't dream of competing with China. Simple. 35% stunting, that means your brain development is going to lag. That means no matter how great your teachers are, you're going to have a problem. Deal with mothers. You have to have healthier mothers, women, and going from mothers in education to employment. Where are the women? Women do not participate. I mean, I don't blame them, but they're not they're not participating in the economy.
Yeah.
We are looking at CMIE data indicates that maybe female labor force participation rates are about 12%, which would place us close to Iraq. Even if you look at ILO kind of estimates of 20%, we're way below where we need to be. The 42% or 41% kind of employment figures that you talk about, it just tells us that we are not doing enough to first get our people prepared and then give them the opportunities. Farmers have now left the Singhu border and other places, and we constantly, you'll hear lots of people talk about how we need to move farmers out of the farms. There are too many farmers at the farms. They have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to go. They would love to leave this backbreaking work, but they have nowhere to go because we're not creating those opportunities elsewhere. Why are we not creating those opportunities? That is what this question is about. I think it's not just about, like I said, I keep saying it's not just about ease of doing business. Of course, you want companies to do well, and they should be free to do a lot of things. It's also about getting into this mindset that you should, in some way, say, we have to get to 2047. We want to be a $12,500 per capita income country. We don't want $5 trillion economy. We don't want $10 trillion economy. We want happy people with good income.
Yeah.
What can we do to make that happen? And to my mind, there's a slew of things that need to happen. By the way, some of the things that are not in this book, and this is almost 500 pages, it has so many chapters, but there are things like judicial reforms, police reforms, lots of other things happen. And that's what make for an economy. We have to think of it in totality. But when we think of the big picture, we have to think bottom up. I think we need to empower, the smallest levels of government, and communities, and then we may see something. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to see anything. I'll stop here.
We are unfortunately completely out of time, but I hear your impassioned plea, Salman and Ajay. Thank you for adding so much nuance to the debate. Congratulations on this book. I think it was a great read for anyone trying to understand not just the problem, but the solutions. So thank you again for writing it and for speaking with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.